Zealand. The semi-final of the Rugby League World Cup, England versus New Zealand, Saturday from 3, live on Grandstand.
For the prisoners singled out by Hitler,
we assumed we were digging our own graves.
The war became a personal battle for freedom. Colditz.
We were not to be allowed to survive it.
How 7 men defied the most notorious symbol of wartime oppression. The War Behind the Wire, tomorrow at 9 on BBC Two.
If it is global warming, then it's going to happen more and more regularly.
Britain is under threat.
Everything collapsed in the water, so she's virtually lost everything.
After the worst floods for 100 years.
I hope it's a freak. I mean, I don't remember rainfall like this in my lifetime.
Panorama asks, has global warming caught us by surprise?
This whole experience will hopefully produce the wake-up that everyone's needed.
Panorama, exposing the truth, Sunday at 10:15 on BBC One.
Gwyneth Paltrow and top comedian Adam Sandler with Jonathan Ross. Film 2000 in an hour on BBC One.
Tonight on Question Time, the Secretary of State for Defence, Geoff Hoon, Theresa May, the Shadow Education and Employment Secretary, Lord Dalakya, President of the Liberal Democrats, Rowan Pelling, Editor of the Erotic Review, and Lloyd Grossman, English Heritage Commissioner for the North West, and from this week in charge of improving food in Britain's hospitals. Good evening. Thanks so much. Good evening. Welcome to Blackburn, Lancashire. And our first question, which comes from Diane Pitt, a part-time lecturer and researcher. Diane Pitt.
Good evening. Does the panel agree that in a climate where the NHS appears to be lunging from crisis to catastrophe, an injection of 40 million to improve hospital food seems inappropriate?
Right. This is the job that Lloyd Grossman has been asked to undertake, or has agreed to undertake. Theresa May, what do you think of it?
Well, I think that there is an issue about hospital food, but I'm not sure it's about the quality of hospital food. One of the things that concerns me, and I've actually seen this and had complaints from people who've seen it happen to their relatives as well, is the way all too often, particularly for elderly patients, the food is just sort of put down in front of them, and no effort is made by the nursing staff to actually help them to eat it. And then they don't eat it, and the nurses come along, and it's taken away.
So Lloyd Grossman's going to be there sort of shoveling it in there.
I'm not quite sure what Lloyd Grossman is going to do, but I mean, I think that is a genuine issue, and I think a lot of elderly patients find that happens, and they end up not eating their food, because that's sort of the care that used to happen in terms of nurses being with them. And of course, all too often it's because the nurses don't have time now, because as you say, the NHS is in a crisis and does have a real problem. There aren't enough nurses. The government has put a lot of money into it, and yet what do we see? We see that the waiting times to get on the waiting lists are going up.
Okay, well, what about the 40 million being spent by Lloyd Grossman improving hospital food? Is that appropriate or not?
I don't think that £40 million is appropriate to go into improving hospital food. I think that we need to do rather more, as I've just said, in terms of the care that the patients are getting. And I would have hoped that Lloyd Grossman ought to be able to do it for less than 40 million, actually, with his enormous skills in the catering field. But there are issues in the health service that are beyond this food issue. And yet again, I think the government has gone for a gimmick to grab the headline, rather than actually addressing the real problems in the NHS, which is waiting times going up and lack of nursing staff.
Of course, it was the Tories who asked Prue Leith to do exactly the same job in the 80s, wasn't it? Okay. Lloyd Grossman.
Hang on a minute, it doesn't mean so I approved of that either.
Oh, I see. Lloyd Grossman.
Okay, before I sort of give a straightforward answer to your question, I've got to respond to a couple of things that Theresa said, which were just total hogwash. Namely, it's not a gimmick. I'm strictly and scrupulously an independent person, and when I was first approached by the NHS to do this, by Alan Milburn, the Secretary of State, I took great care to make sure that this was not a PR exercise, and I said I would not get involved unless there was a real political will to improve NHS catering. I don't think that's a partisan issue. I think if we can make the catering better, a lot of people are going to benefit. I don't know if it's going to cost £40 million. I don't know if it's going to cost £10 million. I don't know if we're going to end up saving £50 million, which is currently what the NHS loses in food wastage because the food isn't good enough, it's not served to the right people at the right time. So what we want to do is come up with some practical solutions that are going to benefit some patients and enable people not to think that they're going to have a sort of 3-star Michelin gourmet experience in a hospital, which would be ridiculous and inappropriate.
So why do you have the chefs from the Ivy and the Caprice and the Savoy Hotel in London doing this if they're not going to get...
For an extraordinary simple reason. They're incredibly talented, they're very bright, and they're willing to give a lot of time for nothing to something that's going to benefit a lot of people.
Okay. The woman in the fourth row there.
In the health service, and I'm sure that we should get the fundamentals right, and I'm not so sure that a dash of balsamic vinegar is any comfort to the patients we've heard of this week strapped to commodes.
There's no question, there is absolutely no question of that. And I was really extraordinarily irritated by one of the more moronic tabloids, which insisted on misrepresenting what we were going to do and say, oh, it's all about bringing gourmet food to the NHS. It's not. People who are in hospitals don't need balsamic vinegar, and they don't need Radicchio, and they don't need all that sort of nonsense. What they do need is decent food served at a time when they want it, that's going to be wholesome and that is not going to be a punishment. That's what we're trying to do. And if you don't think that's worth doing, you're off your rocker. Because I've spoken to lots of patients, and they want better catering in the NHS.
Okay. Navneet Dholakia.
I think Ross is absolutely right. There are two separate issues. One is there's a gross under-expenditure as far as the National Health Service is concerned. There is a need for more investment. Against that, I think we also got to bear in mind that food itself plays a very important part in hospitals. I've been in hospitals, I have seen what the food is like. At times, we had to ring the pizza house outside to get a piece coming out so that we could eat something because the food was uneatable. But can I just say this, that the comparison that has been given to me, that the food in hospital is sometimes far worse than the food we serve to our prisoners. And I think that is the level at which we treat our sick people, then there is something very fundamentally wrong. Do not mix it with investment, which is much more required in health service, and that is what we should be doing.
Okay. The woman in the third row there.
One of the problems that people were saying is that meals are being taken away before the person's finished them. Surely that £40 million could basically pay for more nurses to give a better standard of care and to stay around the patients and help them eat it if needs be, instead of paying for what Lloyd's getting involved in.
Rowan Pelling.
Well, I don't have any fundamental objection to food being better in hospitals, but I think the timing of this announcement was very insensitive, particularly this week, with all the reports of the abuse in various hospitals. And let's face it, somebody can bring you food in hospital. Your mother can bring you sandwiches, your wife can bring you something. But you can't bring someone to your bed and get them to do a hip operation. So clearly, I think it would have been better if you could have heard that 40 million would be put into nurses' salaries or into operating theatres.
Okay. And the one there on the third,
I've actually worked in quality assurance for one of the best retailers in the country and also for manufacturers of hospital food. And the quality of the food is absolutely massive. So I completely agree.
It's massive?
Massive.
Yeah.
It's just like the grade of meat, the spices used, the cooking techniques, everything. They're just worlds apart. So I completely agree with this £40 million. And also, it's fundamental to a person's health. If they don't eat correctly, they're not going to get healthy.
Okay, so you're in favour. You say?
Over the last few years, there have been situations in some hospitals where there's been listeria and salmonella. So I think £40 million investment in the catering is an excellent idea, and it's a positive move forward.
Okay, and you said the very back, on the right there.
Surely, I mean, what Rossman doing this job is some sort of PR exercise.
The PR exercise having him do it. Well, he's defended himself. Jeff Hoon.
Well, can I first of all say, the NHS is not in crisis. The NHS has problems. It has problems that we are trying to tackle with the largest sustained investment in the National Health Service that it's ever had in its history. In the last 2 years, 10,000 extra nurses, almost 5,000 extra doctors, 38 major building programs across the country, reduced waiting lists, a whole series of initiatives like NHS Direct to provide more effective services for people. Now, there are problems. I'm not pretending that there are not problems, but to describe what happens in the National Health Service today as a crisis is actually to misunderstand the tremendous hard work by doctors and nurses right across the country. And as far as the food is concerned, with all due respect to Lloyd, what I actually think should have happened is that they should have employed a team of army chefs who have just been voted the best chefs in Europe, and indeed who have Frenchmen queuing up in Kosovo to eat their food.
So they made the wrong decision, really? They should have come to the Ministry of Defence.
I think they should have come to the Ministry of Defence. But I do think it's very important that we treat the NHS in the way that it deserves to be treated. This is something that every other country in the world is proud of. Let's make it better. There are problems, but that's what we're trying to do, to make it work, to make it effective, to deliver the service that we can be proud of.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean,
I just want to ask any members of the armed forces here who'd like to comment on army cooking. Just, yeah, you do. You.
I was in the army for 5 years, and I don't know what he is completely different from me.
Okay, I have to say that when I go, the food is always excellent.
Can I just say that the fact that Jeff Hoon was willing to sit here tonight and just say that the NHS isn't in crisis, I think just shows how out of touch the government is with what is actually happening. It's all very well to sit in Westminster to talk about these sums of money. What is happening in the hospitals is that they are having problems recruiting nurses. There are not enough nurses. The waiting times to get on the waiting list to get your operation is going up yet again. What we see for some hospitals is they have real problems with bed blocking, and that is even before we get into the possibility of a winter crisis and a lot of elderly patients coming into the hospital.
You've both had your say on the state of the NHS, and we're dealing with the food issue, and I want to stick with that just for a moment longer. You, sir, in the third row, yes. No, the gentleman with the long locks, yes.
I just wondered if any of Mr. Grossman's own sources would feature on the new menu, or would that put us above budget for the 40 million?
I deplore any attempt at product placement on Question Time. But I think, but just to get back to the issue, and actually to address this issue of PR gimmick, the thing is, do you want to do it? Because you can, okay? You run the review of NHS catering. If you think that I've been dragged in to be some sort of PR gimmick, you are completely wrong. I find it incredibly insulting. You're misreading exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to make things better for some patients, right? We are giving our time and our expertise to do that. If you don't like that, I'm really sorry. You come and do it.
I'm not saying I don't like it. I'm just saying they've obviously brought you in as a celebrity, or sort of a celebrity, to try and
So does that make me not able to do the job?
I never said that. I just said it's some sort of PR exercise.
It is not a PR exercise. It is an attempt to do something good for some patients. And if everyone here is so cynical that they think that's wrong, I'd like to know.
I didn't say it was wrong. I'm just saying that's how it looks to the public, or to myself.
Well, it is completely not the case. It is a simple attempt to do something good for the patients in our hospital.
If anyone thinks it's wrong in principle that food should be edible, I think what seems insulting is that you're told, here's £40 million for food, in the same week that there are all these releases about patients who are being, elderly patients being abused, tied to commodes, that you have all these problems in heart hospitals.
The NHS is huge and complex. There are going to be 25 NHS stories. The tabloids happen to like this particular story. And that's why they picked up on it, and that's why they were writing many silly and inaccurate things about it. The point is, no one was attempting to use this to smother other stories about the NHS. We've got to do whatever we can, not just as members of either the Labour Party, the Conservatives, or the Liberal Democrats, but just as citizens who live here. We've got to do whatever we can to try to make the NHS better.
Okay, no, we'll move on now, because we've been on that for nearly a quarter of an hour, so I think we better move on, or we'll just deal with Lloyd Grossman and cooking for the rest of the evening. Interesting as that would be, we take a question from Oz Ali, who is an artist. Mr. Ali.
After the Hatfield train disaster, isn't it sickening that the government is about to sell 51% of the air traffic control?
Despite, of course, a backbench revolt this very week. Navneet Dholakia.
Of course,
I think learned our lesson in the way the rail service was privatized. We should have known better. And I think what we have done in the House of Lords is actually threw it out and sent it back to the government. They have now found at least about 47 Labour members voting against. It is coming back to the House of Lords, and can I say to the government, you'll get it back again. We are not going to approve.
What do you say to the Junior Minister Nick Rainsford, who said what you were doing in the House of Lords was a dangerous precedent, entirely inappropriate, straying into very dangerous territory in constitutional terms to vote against the government on an issue like this?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with him, because it's all very well to talk about...
Well, I gathered you didn't agree with him, but what do you say...
Yes, I would tell him precisely that how